Well, I'm Penny Bernstock, and I suppose it might be helpful to say something about why I'm even interested in thinking about this topic. And I, like Phil, have a long-standing connection with East London. In fact, I grew up in Whitechapel, and my mum still lives in Whitechapel. I've lived in Hackney, and poor housing was very much part of my experience of growing up. So for me, I wanted to do something about that. And first of all, I worked with Sue Brown, who was here today, at the Docklands Forum, and we looked at the Docklands development and thought, you know, this is really a terrible outcome for local people. So when London won the bid, in fact, I was very optimistic. I was actually very hopeful that, in fact, this would be a different kind of project. It would be something that would actually deliver a more inclusive scheme. And I was actually taken in, if you like, by the policy commitments. And I'm not saying that they were dishonest commitments, but I myself thought, yeah, this could be something really, really positive. And I set out from 2005 to begin to monitor all of the things around housing legacy. And some of you might have seen the book that I wrote around housing legacy. So, as I say, I started off, I wasn't an Olympic skeptic, actually. I was quite positive that something positive could come out of this. And, you know, I've got the picture here of the walnut whip. We were all in London, you know, for the price of a walnut whip, 38p a week. We would all buy into this Games, and this Games would give us something for everybody. It would be inclusive. And you know, you didn't have to convince people of the need for the Games in East London, because East London had some of the highest levels of deprivation in the country, and some of the highest levels of housing need. And, you know, the levels of housing need in Newham, where we are standing at the moment, is some of the most extreme in the country. And so the idea of a long-standing legacy was very, very attractive. So, as Phil's already said, the most enduring legacy will be the benefit of an entire community, for the direct benefit of everyone that lives there, and a model of social inclusion. And Sebastian Coe also began to write and say, well, actually, you know, this will be a catalyst for much affordable housing, many, you know, affordable housing, everything. There was going to be lots, but it was never actually very specific about how much affordable housing there would be and how it would be delivered and how it would be funded. In fact, the GLA website, the day we won the Games, had 50% affordable housing, and that disappeared the following day, and I could never find that reference after that. And it went from 50% to many much, you know, these kind of... So we still had that sense it was going to be quite a lot of affordable housing. Now, when we look at Stratford, 2016, you know, 11 years on, we're talking now about gentrification on steroids. So something has happened between 2005 and 2016. And one of the things that we can see is that there's lots and lots of housing. So that's not a problem. We've got lots of housing being built in Stratford, but it's the wrong kind of housing, and it's not going to meet those kind of needs. It's going to actually exacerbate lots of those problems that there already exist. And I think part of the problem lay in the mechanisms for how we thought from the very beginning about legacy. So although we said this is going to be about regeneration, and Ken Livingstone made it clear that he was actually not interested in sport, he was interested in regeneration, there was never the actual mechanisms in place that thought adequately about what would it be to regenerate East London, what would be the shape of that regeneration. And we also had possibly too many legacy commitments, too much. We were going to have no white elephants, so every venue would be utilised. You know, so that in itself became a problem. I mean, just thinking about the Olympic Stadium, imagine if we didn't have a legacy to keep that as an Olympic Stadium or to keep that for sports, and we actually flat-packed that space, then we really would have a lot of space to do quite a lot of regeneration in. So that you know, the kind of legacy venues has become a problem in itself. The cost, as we know, of West Ham going into the stadium is more than 700 million, the cost to the taxpayer, and it would cost about 700 million to restore the Carpenter's estate, so that everybody could, you know, we could move back in and have lots of social housing. So that again is a problem. So from the very beginning, there was a failure to define what is regeneration and to think about it, because actually, you know, we talk about regeneration, but we don't actually say, what is it? What does it mean? How would it be to regenerate Stratford so that in 30, 40 years, whatever we do, we'll have lasting benefits and will deliver jobs and housing after that? in terms of the budget, £9 billion was spent on the games, but the budget was completely for the games. It was for clearing the park, and it was not for there was never any money for Legacy. So somehow Legacy was going to magically happen through some kind of trickle-down process. So I think that was a problem. And I think another thing, if we were going back and we were looking at how did London do, I mean, I think there are quite lots of positive things, and lots of that will come out in different talks today. But I think one of the things that we didn't do was think about why do we continually bulldoze everything in an area and start afresh? Why don't we think about how could we integrate fantastic schemes like a housing co-op or a traveller's site into the regeneration? Why do we bulldoze everything? And partly it's because people in policy were panicking about time, about the need to deliver on time, and certain objectives got higher priority than other objectives. So the fear of not delivering on time, particularly because other games had been, right up until the end, getting their sites prepared, I think had an impact on the way in which London dealt with this issue, and in particular the way in which London moved very quickly people off of those sites without working through choices that would have really reflected this commitment to inclusion. Because if you have a commitment to inclusion, it should be at every level, to the people that are displaced as well as the people that are going to move in. But it was all very quick. So in terms of thinking about housing legacies, I think there's a number of ways of thinking about London's housing legacy. There's the issue of displacement. There's the issue of the conversion of the athletes' village as a more formal dimension of legacy. There's the housing on the park, which is a big part of the housing legacy. And then there's the kind of informal legacies that come out of major regeneration projects, such as we can see in Stratford, and we'll talk about in a second, rising land values and house prices. And also the accelerated regeneration of the wider area. And again, anyone going along the Lower Lee Valley, anyone cycling, some people cycle along the Lower Lee Valley, you'll see lots and lots of new housing being built. But if you like, it's the wrong kind of housing, depending on your perspective. So just to talk about displacement, and I think why I think partly there's a sense of feeling a bit cheated, is that the idea of legacy, although it was never developed and though it was never formalised what this legacy would be, was used as a trump card, if you like, to be able to get rid of all the opposition and say these people are trying to hold us back, they're backward, we need to move forward. And so the CPO inquiry, I think, is quite important in that. In my consideration, this was the summing up of the inspector, of the objections relating to the Clays Lane estate, the overt sense of community and the value that many residents put on their homes and their surroundings is foremost in my mind. Their loss will be substantial. However, I find the anticipated benefits and the catalytic effect of the games to be a more convincing factor. So, there's this promise of legacy used as a trump card to push all other kind of uses off. And then we come to the question, well, what do we have? What is the nature of this legacy? So let's think a bit about the Athletes' Village. The Athletes' Village is a fantastic scheme in terms of design. It's been converted to East Village. It's had lots of money spent on it. And in a sense, one of the things that the Olympics shows us is that we can solve problems if we have the money and if we have the will. So there was the money to make the Athletes' Village into East Village and to work. And therefore we have this very attractive new housing scheme on the park, which does include quite a lot of affordable housing. But it was controversial in some ways because some people argued, in fact, it wasn't even any additional housing, because in 2005, before we won the bid, we also agreed to have something called Stratford City. And Stratford City was going to have around 5,000 new homes, 30% of which would be affordable. And what has happened is that when we see the Athletes' Village and we see that as a legacy, in fact, what we're actually seeing is the building out of the Stratford City project. And in fact, what's happened is that the taxpayer essentially picked up the affordable housing obligation by providing the village there. So, and I think there is a tendency when we're thinking about the games and the legacy to conflate the two. We look at Stratford City and we talk about what's happened as a result of that, and in fact we do need to separate and measure the two projects separately. And obviously, where you have two schemes, they will have an impact as well on that. So just thinking about the East Village, it's as I say, it's a great scheme in many ways. It's 50% affordable housing, so it's a genuinely mixed community, and it's probably one of the most genuinely mixed communities of any housing scheme in London currently. But it's a mixed community in part because it's got an exceptional policy. So the social rented housing target rent, if we were delivering a scheme now, we don't have that anymore. We don't have those kind of schemes. So we had an exception. We had to apply exceptional rules in order to deliver genuinely affordable housing. But then the other part of the housing at East Village is not the other that we call affordable housing, really serves to illustrate the tensions between affordable housing and what is genuinely affordable. So we have a shared ownership unit on the park, 3-bedroom, currently being marketed. You need a minimum income of 73,000 for that scheme. So that's a household income. And Newham has household income, median average household income of 29k. So you can see the problem. We have something called affordable housing, but it's not clear who it's affordable to. And then you have the intermediate rent, which is another dimension that is developed as part of affordable housing, where essentially it's a capped rent, so you pay less than the market rent. And the problem is that Stratford's success in terms of rising land values is meaning that those properties are becoming more and more expensive. So an affordable rent intermediate unit 2 years ago was £1,200, and now it's gone down. It's gone up rather to £1,400. So that's a problem. So that's the East Village, and there's issues there around allocations as well, and I'm sure that will be picked up in talks later on. Then there's the plans for the park itself, and again there's clearly going to be lots of new housing on the park, which is a really good thing. The Olympic Park Legacy Company were appointed in 2009, and they began to really think about what legacy would be, and they had a wide-scale consultation, and they come up with the idea that we needed housing that would meet local needs, we needed much more family housing, and there should be 35 to 40% affordable housing. However, that was then cut in 2011, and we had this new idea that there would be a minimum 20% and a maximum 35%. Now, you begin to see the problem when you start to talk about a minimum of 20% affordable housing. So you've got 80% of the housing that you won't be able to afford. You've got 20% allegedly affordable, and even within that, part of that is likely to be very expensive affordable housing if we go down that. So it's not okay when you're starting to reduce it. If we did end up with a minimum of 20%, even if we end up with a minimum of 35%, it still should be higher. And then in 2013, it was revised downwards again as a whole scheme to 31%. So that's a problem. I'm not going to talk about the different schemes, but the new there's East Village, and there's a new neighbourhood, Chobham Manor, just being developed currently. And first phase sold off plan, 2-bedroom uses £675,000. So this is again a problem. And the affordable shared ownership 1-bedroom unit, you need an income of £70,000 to be able to get a 1-bedroom affordable shared ownership unit. And then, so you've got the formal legacy, you've got East Village, you've got housing on the park, and then you've got the kind of more informal legacy of the Olympics, which is a whole range of new towers being built. And these new towers capitalise, they use the fact that we hosted the games as a kind of marketing tool, because Stratford's Plaza 10 years ago would have no meaning to anybody, but Stratford Plaza today becomes a commodity for international investors thinking, oh, that's Stratford. Yes, we know Stratford because it was, part of the games. So it becomes a commodity, the kind of brand. It becomes a new brand in terms of housing. So we've got lots of new blocks being built around Stratford. And I think one of the Manhattan Loft Gardens doesn't have any affordable housing in it, and it's being marketed by Harrods Estates, and you could be looking at paying up to £1 million. So no doubt that Stratford has been gentrified at a massive pace. Then you have the rising rent values, and you have Newham emerging as this buy-to-let hotspot. And this is sad, because part of the reason why we wanted to build more housing and more market housing, it was argued on the park, was that it would attract people in Newham that may perhaps would have left the area when they had seen an improvement in their incomes. They would then be able to buy in. But what you're having is private housing that is being bought mainly by investors. So you're not going to get a sustainable community, and the people that might live in the affordable housing there's not that much housing. So what we can see then is that we're on track really for an exclusive housing legacy, with large new areas of real estate capitalised on by private sector developers and buy-to-let landlords. I need a few more minutes. Okay. So the question then is, why this gap between policy intentions and policy outcomes? How has it all gone so wrong? And I think partly I kind of alluded to that at the beginning, that the bid was won in a period of growth. We had a Labour mayor, we had a Labour government, we didn't think we were going to win the bid, and we didn't actually have proper plans for how we would have a legacy. So to give you some quotes, it was all a bit back of the envelope. This was from a councillor. There was a piece of land and we thought we could build this much housing. It was just to wave at the IOC to establish the principle that we were having the games. Some people got too bogged down in the detail. Well, I think actually the devil is always in the detail. So, and then another one, the bid was a marketing tool, and it was just really about trying to win the game. So partly then, there was never really any thought out plans, as I say, just assumptions. And I don't think people were, it was a conspiracy to trick us, but just this idea that yes, we'd have the games, and yes, somehow things would kind of evolve in that way. The other thing is that the kind of policy instruments, if you like, that might have helped us to deliver affordable housing in 2005 have all but been dismantled. So Ken Livingstone had an aspiration of 50% affordable housing, and we do know that that was very rarely reached, but nevertheless it was an aspiration that you would capture value from new developments through the use of planning gain, which would then deliver affordable housing to residents. We know that target rents that were linked to median and low incomes have been replaced by affordable rents. And affordable rents, which are linked to market cost of housing, are particularly problematic in an area that sees property-led regeneration and an increase in land values. And it really raises huge questions about the way in which we are regenerating in the UK, which is always seems to be underpinned by this idea of property-led regeneration. We've also got this more general shift in terms of thinking about space and thinking about the market as a key to determining who should live in that space, as opposed to social democratic principles that think that people on a range of income should live in an area. So this idea that the market should determine where you live, I think fundamentally undermines the idea that low-income families are even entitled to live in Stratford as it improves. I think there's also an issue of governance and the range of agencies that were involved and conflicting ideas. I think the London Borough of Newham had one idea and the GLA had another. The ODA, interesting, the ODA submitted something under Stratford Village Holdings. They created this company in 2009 around one of the plots of land they had, where they argued that we don't think there should be any social housing to dilute the high levels of social housing elsewhere. And I think we have to ask a question about the role of a government agency with a brief for long-term legacy and regeneration actually trying to reduce the social housing. But I think what it highlights is that tension, and there is, for lots of people, concentrations of social housing continue to be a problem. And I think until we challenge those ideas that high levels of social housing are a problem, I think that creates a tension. So in other words, there's not a lot of agencies signing up and saying this is really bad, we need a lot more social housing down here. We have a new mayor that is saying that. And I think in terms of governance, one way of going forward would be to bring in some of the grassroots groups that have emerged, Focus E15, Berlin 100, London Citizens. And if those people were involved in discussing how we move forward in terms of housing legacy, I think the nature of that housing legacy will begin to change. I think we need to have a different kind of voice in terms of who is talking about what needs to happen. So, okay.
Go on, 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. The real question is really about regeneration, what it is, what should it be, how do you get inclusive growth, how do you create the kinds of jobs that are going to enable you to live in the kind of housing that's being built there. So we have things like the London Living Wage, which are great. The London Living Wage equates to about £19,500. So we need housing that's going to map onto that. So the London Living Rent is a possibility. So I think how we get back on track is that we do need to be arguing for 50% affordable housing as a minimum on the park. We need to be thinking, the park cannot solve London's housing crisis. That's a really big housing crisis. But it could be a place to testbed new models of housing finance, new ways of doing things. And it could capitalise on all of this construction knowledge in East London and have decent conditions of work, people building housing, and East London companies. We could actually, if the local authority or the LLDC became a developer building housing, they could capitalise on the uplift through the land values to deliver affordable housing. So I think the legacy is not, okay. As I say, we need to be thinking about how we ensure that London is really left with something very inspirational and lasting, and we need to apply exceptional arrangements to make sure that something happens in London that is really genuinely able to meet those original objectives of ensuring that it benefits the interests of people living in East London. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Pat.